And he began to speak unto them by parables. A certain man planted a vineyard, and set a hedge about it, and digged a place for the wine fat, and built a tower, and let it out to husbandmen, and went into a far country. And at the season he sent to the husbandmen a servant, that he might receive from the husbandmen of the fruit of the vineyard. And they caught him, and beat him, and sent him away empty. And again he sent unto them another servant, and at him they cast stones, and wounded him in the head, and sent him away shamefully handled. And again he sent another, and him they killed, and many others, beating some and killing some. Having yet therefore one son, his well-beloved, he sent him also last unto them, saying, They will reverence my son. But those husbandmen said amongst themselves, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance shall be ours. And they took him and killed him, and cast him out of the vineyard. What shall therefore the Lord of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the husbandmen, and will give the vineyard unto others. Mark chapters 12, verses 1 through 9. To Baha'u'llah, Jesus Christ had referred as the Prince of this world, as the Comforter who will reprove the world of sin, and of righteousness, and of judgment, as the Spirit of truth who will guide you into all truth, who shall not speak of himself, but whatsoever he shall hear, that shall he speak, as the Lord of the vineyard, and as the Son of Man, who shall come in the glory of his Father, in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, with all of the holy angels about him, and all nations gathered before his throne. Shogi Effendi.
So this week, we're very happy to have Mr. Jay Tyson, and he'll be speaking about prophetic fulfillment at the close of the age. Jay Tyson grew up outside of Detroit, Michigan, and graduated from Princeton University with a degree in civil engineering in 1976. He and his wife, Eileen, spent 4 years in Liberia, where Jay worked on road construction projects. They also spent 7 years in Haifa, Israel, where he assisted with historic restoration at the Baha'i World Center. They returned to New Jersey in 1989, where they raised 2 daughters, and Jay continued his career in civil engineering. Raised in a Presbyterian household, Jay was apt from an early age to deeply ponder spiritual matters. He became a member of the Baha'i Faith in 1970, and has long observed a daily regime of reading scriptures or books on religion and religious history. The Wise Men of the West, A Search for the Promised One in the Latter Days, is his first novel and reflects his commitment to studying religion, history, and geography. His years in the Holy Land also gave him the opportunity to travel to many of the locations in which the first half of the story is set. And with that, I'll hand it off to Mr. Tyson.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here today. Yeah, we have a lot of material when we're talking about the prophecies of the various religions and their fulfillment. So I think I will start simply by going to a slide presentation. I simply wanted to start out by letting you know that we're going to be talking about the Baha'i Faith and its connection to other religions through prophecy. The Baha'i Faith is the newest world religion, particularly if you define world religion as a set of beliefs that is able to attract people from all cultures and all existing belief systems. There are, of course, others that lay claim to be a new religion. However, they remain firmly grounded in their parent religion. The Baha'i Faith is the only recent one that has successfully transitioned from its initial roots to become a worldwide phenomenon. And the reason that the Baha'i Faith has found adherents of many religious backgrounds is not simply because many of its moral teachings resonate with the teachings of the older religions, nor is it entirely because they're able to leave behind many of the problematic teachings of the older religions, which are no longer applicable in the modern world. In addition, one of the main reasons it has been able to attract the followers of other religions is that there are prophetic statements in their own religions, in the older religions, that have been fulfilled in the middle of the 19th century by the coming of a pair of teachers who claim to be divinely inspired, fulfilling their prophecies. These two did not know each other beforehand, and it appears that they never met in person. The first one took the name or the title, the Gate, which in Arabic is the Bab, in 1844. His role, in some respects, was similar to that of John the Baptist. He prophesied that a greater messenger would soon come. And several years later, the second one took the title of the Glory of God, which in Arabic is Baha'u'llah. His revelation began in a prison dungeon in 1852 and continued for 40 years while he remained in prison or exile or under house arrest. His role was, in many respects, similar to that of Jesus, Moses, Abraham, and Muhammad. So we'll take a look at this slide, which shows the prophetic connections between the religions, the various religions of the past. And it's important to recognize that there are many connections. And to understand that prophetic connections imply the oneness of God and the oneness of religion. The diagram shows how there are many connections. We can today only scratch the surface because we could go into any one of these connections for an extended period if we had the time. So for convenience in this diagram, I've placed the older religions at the top and the Western religions at the right, Eastern religions more toward the left. And I've shown, I've enumerated the connections. You'll see the numbers on each connection pertain to the slides that we're going to be viewing. Also, you'll note that there are a few dotted lines. There's a dotted line between Judaism and Zoroastrianism, and also a dotted line between Zoroastrianism and Hinduism. These are not prophetic connections, but there are historic connections between these religions. The Jewish Zoroastrian, partly because the Jewish people were taken away into captivity for, I don't know, for a long time. I guess it was over 100 years when they were in Babylon and then in Persia. You'll also notice that there's a large arrow between Judaism and Christianity. There are, of course, a lot of prophecies which Christians recognize that come from the Old Testament and indeed bind together Christianity with Judaism. There are really too many to go into today. You probably would recognize a statement like, this is to fulfill that which was uttered by the prophets Isaiah or Ezekiel or Jeremiah or whichever. And so because there's so many and because they're widely recognized, I'm not going to go into them today. But there is a very strong connection, and really why Christians talk about Judeo-Christianity is that the connection was so strong that the Christians even keep the Old Testament as part of their Holy Bible. So instead, today we'll be focusing on, first of all, 4 connections between the older religions, numbered 1 through 4 here, followed by 7 connections linking the religions of the past to the Baha'i and Baha'i faiths. I've written about this, as was mentioned, in a book, a novel called The Wise Men of the West. I just wanted to show that here because much of the material today is also mentioned in the novel. The novel, of course, is a story because it's perhaps easier for people to follow along, to learn a perspective by traveling with fictional characters who are themselves learning as they travel. So you'll find as we go through the rest of the talk that I've placed references from the book in the talk. So I like to start off, especially when I'm speaking with the Christian audience, to speak of the Zoroastrian references to the coming of Jesus. You may recall one of the first stories in the New Testament was the story of the wise men of the East. And to clarify, the term wise men was actually something that was developed by the translators who wrote the King James English version of the Bible. They were translating from the Greek Bible, which used the term magi. And of course, magi was a reference to the religious class in Persia, the Zoroastrian religious class. Sometimes I explain that it is almost like if you were living in Europe in the 1960s and somebody mentioned a cosmonaut from the East, you would, of course, you wouldn't have to know that that cosmonaut was from the Soviet Union. You would know because the term cosmonaut was unique to the Soviet Union at that time, and that the East was the huge country to the East that really covered most of the East. So in a like fashion, the Magi were the class of Persians that were, the Bible says, from the East, and the East, the large empire to the East was Persia. What motivated them to come? This isn't exactly clear in the biblical story. However, there is something called the infancy, the Syriac Infancy Gospel, which was a collection of early stories about Jesus from the time of his infancy and childhood. And in that is a story about the coming of the wise men, which in some respects is word for word the same as what's in the book of Matthew, except one thing that's said in that quote in that gospel is that they came because of a prophecy of Zoroaster. And what exactly did the prophecy say? Unfortunately, the prophecy is lost to history, but it was accurate enough to cause the Magi to travel westward. It was perhaps a 1,000-mile journey, so this was not a small trip, and to successfully find Jesus at the time of his birth. So what does this teach us about the prophet Zoroaster? He must have been a true prophet if he was able to predict something that happens 1,000 years before the event. So it kind of shows us that God's revelation can come from other sources besides the ones that are cited in the Bible itself. It's repeated each year at Christmas, and that shows us that there is this clear connection. Prophecies are links between the religions, and this is a strong link between Christianity and the Zoroastrian religion. The New Testament writers saw the life of Christ as the fulfillment of many Old Testament prophecies. The wise men story clearly shows us the linkage to the Zoroastrian religion as well. Typically, of course, older religions do not recognize the legitimacy of the prophecies, because if they recognize them, they would cease to remain members of the older religion and they would join the new one. And if you have a copy of my book, I put some references there if you wanted to find out more on that topic. Let's speak for a moment about the Old Testament prophecies concerning the coming of Muhammad. We need to go back to Genesis 17:20, where it states that from Ishmael will come 12 princes, and God will make of him a great nation. Now, although Ishmael did have 12 sons, the 12 princes are now understood, certainly by the Baha'is and Muslims, to be the 12 imams, descendants of Muhammad, who guided Islam for the first 260 years. And the great nation that descended from Ishmael was the nation of Islam, which became vastly larger than the Jewish nation, both in terms of numbers and in terms of geographic size. You'll find more on Ishmael in other chapters in Genesis that are listed there. In Deuteronomy 18:18, God says to Moses, "I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee, thee being Moses. The brethren of the Jewish people were the descendants of Isaac's brother, Ishmael. So that seemed to be a prophecy that there would be a prophet that would come from the line of Ishmael. Also, one of the minor prophets, Habakkuk 3, God came from Teman, that is from the south, and the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. Paran and Selah refer to Mecca and Medina, the two sites that are, of course, associated with Muhammad. In the days before Muhammad, one Jewish seeker named Ibn al-Hayyaban, after studying the Jewish scripture, concluded that a prophet would soon appear in the area of Medina. So he moved from Syria in the north to Medina along the western coast of Arabia. He died shortly before Muhammad appeared, but several of his Jewish followers became early followers of Muhammad. So there was a successful connection between the prophecy there. Are there Christian prophecies concerning the coming of Muhammad? There are a few. The reference to the Comforter, which Baha'is understand both as Muhammad and as Baha'u'llah, it can be both. A term that was used, a Greek term, was paraclete, which is very similar to an Arabic term, paraclite, which is listed there, found in John 14, 15, and 16. In Arabic, it means illustrious, and illustrious was one of the names of Muhammad, Ahmad. There are also some veiled references to Muhammad in the book of Revelation. It would take a lot of time to get into those, so I don't think I'm going to attempt that today. But there are also references in some of the non-canonical books, that is, the books that didn't make it into the New Testament, and other works that were kept by Christian monks, especially Nestorians, who lived on the east side of the Jordan River, and that was beyond the control of the Roman Church. So some of the things that they kept were perhaps not welcomed by the church, whatever, but nevertheless, they were outside of the control of the Roman Church, so they kept them. By the time Muhammad was a child, a young child in some cases, a few of these, one by the name of Bahira, one called Waraka, and the other Nestor, individually recognized Muhammad before his revelation began. There's also the story of Salman, a Persian Zoroastrian who became a Christian and followed prophecies from several Christian monks until he found Muhammad in Medina. So some more examples of prophecies that were successful in guiding people to the next messenger. If we turn now to the East, Hinduism, talking about Buddhism, this is a little bit limited in focus in my book because the book is written primarily to a Christian audience. But we have a general statement from Krishna: when goodness grows weak, when evil increases, I make myself a body. In every age I come back to deliver the holy, to destroy the sin of the sinner, to establish righteousness. Hinduism describes the messengers of God as avatars and identifies Krishna as the eighth one. It also identifies one who will come back at the close of the age as Kalki, the 10th avatar. In between, there must be a 9th avatar. Buddhists, of course, understand this to be the Buddha. And kind of surprisingly, I was surprised to learn that many Hindus have come to recognize also Buddha as the 9th avatar. This reportedly started somewhere around the year 500 AD, that this kind of transition took place in Hinduism. Although they still remain Hindu, instead of becoming Buddhists, they recognize Buddha as the 9th avatar. And religions in that part of the world tend to be a little bit more fluid than they are in the West. But during the reign of Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, most of India became Buddhist, and Buddhism spread outward toward Central Asia. Gradually, Hinduism made a resurgence in India itself, while Buddhism grew rapidly in other parts of Eastern and Central Asia. Now, Hinduism and Buddhism are a little bit different from the religions of the West in that they have not made strict efforts to separate the original writings from later additions. While there are some Hindu writings that specifically mention the Buddha, it is not clear whether these were written before or after the appearance of the Buddha. So it's not exactly clear whether they were truly prophetic. And that's one reason that I didn't spend a whole lot of time going into the details on this one. But there is a general sense that there would be a ninth avatar, and we understand that as Buddha. Now, getting into the set of prophecies that look toward the current age, the modern age, Christian prophecies of the return of Christ and the close of the age. For those who want to do some referencing, you find this primarily in Matthew 24 or parallel statements in Luke 21, Mark 13. These contain the majority of Jesus's statements made about the time of the end. John chapters 14 through 16 also contain many references, and Baha'u'llah cites some of these references in the Book of Certitude. The close of the age is explained in particular by Jesus in Matthew 24. He gives several signs which could be understood in a number of ways, but the most specific one is in verse 14, where he says, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world as a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." So it's a very specific marker as to, when the age would close. And this was all asked in the context of when would he return. So the return is supposed to come after the old age closes. The ability of the Christian world to send missionaries to remote nations using their ocean crossing ships is what led Christian thinkers to conclude in the early 1800s that all nations had been reached with the gospel of the kingdom, and that the end of the age had arrived. And even today, you find, I was hearing a program just last night on the radio about some people who explain that Jesus hasn't returned because they haven't quite reached all peoples. There's some remote peoples in the Amazon jungle, they were saying, and they were trying to find helicopters to reach them or something like that. But the actual quote refers to all nations. So that's why most people felt that the early 1800s marked the time when that prophecy had been fulfilled. In addition, Luke 21:11 speaks of fearful sights and great signs there shall be from heaven. And this was particularly noted in 1816, which experienced a year without a summer that caused an ensuing famine. 1833 witnessed perhaps the greatest starfall or meteor shower that had ever been seen. And then in 1843, the largest comet that had ever been seen. So these were all signs that woke people up and kind of spurred on the interest in the coming of a new age. In addition, Jesus had left a clue as to the exact year when he told his followers to refer to the prophecies of the prophet Daniel. That's in Matthew 24:15. In the 1830s, William Miller, a self-taught preacher, was able to unravel this clue by using a known accurate fulfillment of the prophecy given in Daniel 9 by the angel Gabriel concerning the crucifixion of the Messiah. And he applied the same starting point and the same method of measurement to the other prophecy given by Gabriel, which was in Daniel 8. And this led him to predict the return of Christ in 1844. I created this diagram down at the bottom there. So both prophecies begin from 457 BC. There are specific references in the Bible to that year that was given in chapter 9. And counting forward from that same year, 2,300 days, which is 2,300 years, pointed William Miller to 1843 or 1844, depending on how you count the year zero. So this is what really started the modern evangelical movement. Of course, they thought they were expecting Christ to return from the sky, and when it didn't happen, it became known as the Great Disappointment. As to Judaism, the coming of the Messiah is closely aligned with the return of the Jewish people to the Holy Land after being scattered to all nations. References to this go all the way back to the 4th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, which of course is one of the 5 books of Moses. They are repeated by many of the lesser prophets of the Old Testament, and then also repeated by Jesus himself in Luke 21:24, talking about the period in which the Gentiles would control Jerusalem, and then there would be the end of the time of the Gentiles. The book of Malachi 4:5 refers to the return of Elijah prior to the coming of the Messiah. Jesus himself explained that this was fulfilled with the coming of John the Baptist in his time, and Baha'is understand that this would also be fulfilled in our current age with the coming of the Bab. The Old Testament doesn't refer to a particular year other than, as I already mentioned, in Daniel 8, but the Jews didn't understand that because they couldn't understand the reference in Daniel 9. However, there are other Jewish books beyond those found in the Old Testament whose authority is recognized by many Jews. One such book is the Zohar, the Jewish book of mysticism, and it stated that in the year 5600 of the Jewish calendar, the gates of wisdom on high and the well springs of lower wisdom will be opened. Year 5600 in the Christian calendar turns out to be 1839 to 1840, and so there was a close linkage there. In anticipation of the fulfillment of this prophecy, Jewish people started returning to the Holy Land as early as 1808. By 1840, Jewish people in Jerusalem outnumbered all other religious groups. The Ottoman Empire decided to extend the rights of citizenship to all non-Muslims in 1839. So this included the Jews. And so between these two things, the collection of people moving to the Holy Land and the extension of rights, the foundations for the return of the Jews to the Holy Land were laid in the predicted year. Of course, this was 4 years before the declaration of the Bab. However, the earliest beginnings of his revelation may be traced to this time, approximately at least. It is clear from the Baha'i history given in the Dawnbreakers, a book about Baha'i history, that he, the Bab, knew his mission prior to April 1841. So it is very possible that the gates of wisdom on high were first opened in the Jewish year 5600, as predicted in the Zohar. Now, what about Islamic expectations for the close of the age? In spite of some Muslim claims that Muhammad was the last of the prophets or the seal of the prophets, Sunni Muslims expect 2 messengers, the first one known as the Mahdi, the guided one, and the second one referred to as the return of Christ. In Shia Islam, they also expect 2 messengers, the first known as the Qaim, the one who will arise, and the second one called the return of Hussein. Regarding the time, the Sunnis had a general expectation that it would be in the mid-1800s, but no specific year. However, the Shiites believed that Qaim would appear after a 1,000-year day of separation, which is mentioned in the Quran. That period began when the last of the divinely guided imams disappeared, which happened in 260 AH. Therefore, they expected the return in 1260 AH. And 1260 in the Islamic calendar is the year 1844 in the Christian calendar. In the entire field of religious prophecy, this is the most remarkable time-related prediction, that parts of the Christian world were expecting the promised one in the exact same year as parts of the Muslim world. The two dates were based on entirely different sources and methods of calculation, and yet they converged on the exact same year. The prophetic number 1260 is found also in the book of Daniel twice, in the book of Revelation 7 times. No one in the Christian world was able to understand its significance. In retrospect, however, we can see that it's a clear reference to the Muslim period. Of course, Christians, paying virtually no attention to Islam, were unable to recognize this. Another interesting point was that Muhammad reportedly warned his Arab followers that if they failed to live up to the commandments of God, God would replace them with another people. When he was asked which people, he pointed to his Persian follower, Salman, and said, his people. So there was an expectation that when the return happened, it might happen in Persia. So turning to the Zoroastrian prophecies of the coming of Baha'u'llah, Zoroaster spoke of how Seoshyants, I guess that's how you pronounce it, divine messengers like himself would appear at the end of each of 3,000-year periods. Although the exact date of this prophecy is not known, historians generally consider that Zoroaster lived about 1,100 years before Jesus. Thus, Jesus fulfilled the first of these prophecies. Although Muhammad arrived less than 1,000 years later, he, together with the 12 Imams, concluded this period of divine guidance about 2,000 years after Zoroaster. And exactly 1,000 years after the last direct guidance was given by the Muslim Imams, that is about 3,000 years after Zoroaster himself, the Baha'i Faith began. Thus, some of the Zoroastrians in Persia were expecting the appearance of a new messenger in the mid-1800s. And in recognition of this, many have become Baha'is. Concerning Hindu prophecies of coming of the next messenger, for the Western audience, probably the most important prophecy from Hinduism is simply the description of how the messenger arrives, as given in the quote that I mentioned above in section 4, I make myself a body. He does not descend from the physical sky, as many Christians expect. He does not arise from an underground cave or well, as many Muslims expect. He steps forth into the world much as any other person would. Hinduism's expectation of the decline of humanity into a spiritually dark age seemed to be reflected in the general conditions of the time. At that time, the 10th avatar, known as Kalki, was to appear. As to the location, some indications are that he would come from Persia. And more recently, in the 1500s, there was a blind Hindu saint named Surdas who said that the 1,000-year cycle of truth would begin in 1900 on the Vikram Samvat calendar, which was a calendar that was in use at his time and place. It turns out that that calendar began in 56 BC, so that turns out to be 1844 on the Western calendar. Another amazing convergence of time prophecies. If we turn to Buddhism, he speaks of the coming of the next Buddha. Near the end of his life, he made it clear that a future Buddha would arise when he wrote, I am not the first Buddha who came upon earth, nor shall I be the last. In due time, another Buddha will arise in the world, a holy one, a supreme enlightened one, endowed with wisdom in conduct, auspicious, knowing the universe, an incomparable leader of men, a master of angels and mortals. He will reveal to you the same eternal truths which I have taught you. He will preach his religion, glorious at the goal, in the spirit and in the letter. He will proclaim a religious life, holy, perfect, and pure, such as I now proclaim. His disciples will number many thousand, while mine number many hundred. He will be known as Maitreya, which means he whose name is kindness. Baha'u'llah was renowned for his kindness and his generosity wherever he went. In the early years of his life, before being imprisoned for being a Babi, he was known as the father of the poor. So where do the Buddhist prophecies say that he will appear? Or excuse me, when will he appear? Sometime within the final century of the Kali Yuga, the Kali age, that is between 1843 and 1943. And of course, the Babi and Baha'i revelations fit exactly within that time frame. Where would he appear? Some say he will come from the Pure Land, which is Sukhavati, the Western Paradise. So it's kind of interesting that the religions of the West are looking to the East, and the religions of the East are looking to the West. And Persia is the land that lies in between, which thus fulfills both conditions. Finally, just a brief mention of native religions. There are several native religions born before the peoples had developed writing, so they have existed in oral traditions for centuries. Many contain expectations of the coming of a great teacher in the future. In the case of Native American religions, many expect that he will come from the East. However, for the purpose of my book, I did not delve into the details of this aspect of prophecy, except briefly mentioned in one chapter in volume 2. Western knowledge of Native American religions was extremely limited in 1844 at the time that my story takes place. So finally, how did we miss it? The blinders of literalism kept the Christian world looking up into the physical sky. If we had followed Christ's instructions about how it would be like lightning, Matthew 24:27, which comes out of the east, we would have looked to the east. We might have looked at the land of Daniel, which was the land of Elam. Elam is the biblical name for southwestern Persia. And this was the land from which Daniel's prophecies originally came. This is also the land where the Bab appeared 2,300 years later. It struck like lightning in its brilliance and in its disruptive force in Persia. Its thunder is gradually echoing around the world. If we had only followed the example of the wise men of the East, we could have set out in a search with an open heart and mind as a true seeker. Baha'u'llah says of the true seeker, if in the uttermost corners of the East, the sweet savors of God be wafted, he will assuredly recognize and inhale their fragrance, even though he be dwelling in the uttermost ends of the West. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions that people have.
Thank you so much. That was a very interesting talk, and I'm sure we all have a lot of follow-up questions. So you can go ahead and put your questions in the chat now, and we'll have time to discuss. Okay, I'm going to start off with a question. A lot of people ask, so there are metaphors in different holy texts like the Bible, but there are also things that are literal. I mean, how can we distinguish between, Jesus is not actually going to come out of the sky physically, whereas other teachings or writings are actually very literal. So how do we distinguish between the two?
I think that one has to have an open heart and be humble and be detached. One needs to be open to a variety of possibilities. It is also important that people have a sense of the spirit of their own messenger, because if they have a real sense of the Spirit and approach with a detached heart as a true seeker, they will, I think everybody has almost like a sixth sense that can tell whether something rings true. Now, if you're really attached to particular interpretations, then it might be hard to overcome some of those attachments. When, as a Christian, when you think of the early disciples of Christ, Jesus came and he explained a little bit to them, and he said, "Follow me." And they left their professions, they left their family, they were detached, and they were able to accept. The scribes and Pharisees, who had spent their lifetimes studying the details, they were so attached to their own particular interpretations that they could not let go in the same way that the disciples had. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. The next question is, have you ever read the Nag Hammadi?
This is the Gnostic texts. Yeah, I have not actually read them, but I have listened to some lectures on them, and I know that there was an interesting collection of views in the early days of Christianity. Some of them were amalgamations of Greek mythology and Christian or Jewish teachings. It seemed like there were several that kind of wanted to get in on the action, so to speak, but they get kind of wild when you get into the details. So that's what I know. It's interesting to note that even as in today, when there are many different theories about the promised one, the coming of the promised one, it seemed like back in the early days of Christianity, there were many different theories going on simultaneously, and people had to gradually sort them out.
Thank you. The next question is, how do we know that 457 BC was the correct dating for the 490-year prophecy and the 2300-year prophecy?
So that goes back to Daniel chapter 9. That prophecy talks about it sets the date as the time when there was a decree that told the Jewish people that they could return and rebuild Jerusalem. They were captive. They were first captive by the Babylonians, but then Persia took over the Babylonian Empire. And so the king the leader of Persia at some point told them that they should go back and rebuild Jerusalem. And that date is known in history. In fact, it's given as the first day of the year. And since it's known that the Zoroastrian calendar, the first day of the year was the first day of spring, they know not only the year, but also the actual date was March 21st of 457 BC. So this is something that you find both in the Baha'i writings, but also in Christian writings, this recognition of the year 457 BC as the beginning of the prophecy that is cited in Daniel 9. And as I said, what William Miller did was to take the prophecy in Daniel 8 and say, well, this prophecy probably can be counted from the same year as the one in Daniel 9. And when you come forward from 457 BC, the 490 days, which are talked about in Daniel 9, you get to the time that Jesus was crucified, which is what the prophecy was about. So it was clear, it's like you have a firm starting point. And building from there, they were able to come forward to 1843 or 1844, depends on how you count the year zero. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that in the Roman numeral system, you don't have a Roman numeral for zero. They didn't even have the concept of zero. So because of that numerical system, we have a difference of 1 year. So 1844 is actually 2,300 years after 457 BC.
Are your characters in Wise Men of the West fiction or real?
So historical fiction, I say, is a little bit like the movie Titanic. You know, you may remember there was Jack and Rose. They were fictional characters, but it was happening on a historical situation. So many of the other characters were historical characters. And I've been careful in my book, anytime that I come across a historical character, the first time he's mentioned, his name is written in italics. So you can look him up on Wikipedia. All the places in my book, incidentally, are real places. And you can look them up on Wikipedia. And most of the references you can look up on Wikipedia as well. So it is, you know, I say, people ask me how much is fiction, how much is nonfiction. It is like 90% nonfiction. And so much so that at the end of the book, there's an epilogue, and the epilogue is entirely nonfiction.
Got it. Thank you. A number of Persian poets and mystics prophesied the coming of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Hafiz and Sohbat Lari went into detail of where exactly they will appear and what will happen. Could you please explain some of their prophecies?
Well, that would be another interesting one to explore. Yes, I have not explored that. As I say, the the book, as I was writing it, I started to realize that it was getting pretty long. And in fact, it got so long that it had to be divided into volume 1 and volume 2. So about 3/4 of the way through, I said, well, I have to slow down on what I'm including, because it'll just get too long for people to read. But yeah, I would like to explore that again. Anyone who would like to send me what they know on that, I'd be happy to add that to my collection. I think I saw one about the Zohar, and yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. It was a very interesting episode, and something that you don't find in the Baha'i writings. But I came across a book. It seems that the Jewish people who advocated that the Messiah might appear in 1840, when it didn't happen, they became a little bit embarrassed. And, you know, unlike the Christian experience in 1844, they just said, well, it's a great disappointment. And it kind of went down in history as a great disappointment. And it wasn't hidden. In the case of the Jewish prophecy, it seemed like they tried to hide it a little bit. And so for years, there wasn't much written on this episode. While I was doing research, I came across a book called Hastening Redemption, all about this episode. And the author had done a lot of digging into historical archives and texts, and going way back to the beginning, because there wasn't much written between the 1840s and 2006. So it was really fascinating to get the details on what happened at that time. Of course, most people, when they think about the return of the Jewish people to the Holy Land, they tend to think of it happening in the late 1800s, beginning in the late 1800s. But actually, the foundation was laid in the early 1800s with this prophecy, this expectation that the Messiah would come in 1840. So my book, although it's got a lot of Baha'i material in it, it brings in material from other sources as well.
Thank you. In the Bible, Christ says, no one knows the year, only the Father in heaven. He also points to the end of desolation as a sign spoken of by Daniel. How do we reconcile that with the prophecy in Daniel?
Well, it was true at the time. No one knew the year at that time. To say that no one would ever know the year would be to say that there's no point in making any prophecies. And of course, there are prophecies, and the purpose of prophecy is not only to identify the coming of a new messenger, but to help connect the religions to each other. So it's true, no one knew the year at the time the prophecy was issued. In fact, it's kind of interesting when you read the prophecies of Daniel. One of the things he says was that he just could not fathom what was the meaning of this prophecy? And at one point, when the angels tells him, "Go thy way, for it is sealed until the time of the end." It's like the angel tells him, there's no point in even trying to understand this, but it will be understood at the time of the end. So the identification of the close of the age is really critical. And that was, the age. I think if you asked 100 people whether we live in the same age as the age of Jesus, out of even 1,000 people, you would probably find that 999 say we do not live in the same age as Jesus. We live in the modern age, which is unquestionably different from the earlier age. Now, in the beginning of the 1800s, when they were still sailing ships and people were still reading by candlelight and people were still plowing their fields with animals that pulled the plows, you could make a case that maybe that was the same age, similar age to the age of Jesus. But obviously, in the 21st century, we are in no way in the same age as the age of Jesus. So somewhere between the early 1800s and the present day, the old age ended. And Jesus and all the prophecies are supposed to be fulfilled.
Thank you. Did Baha'u'llah descend from Abraham and Zoroaster, and what is the significance of this?
There are family connections between many of the Western prophets. And so, we know that Baha'u'llah actually descended from the third wife of Abraham, Keturah, Muhammad from Hagar, and of course the Jewish prophets descended from Isaac and Sarah. So these were three roots of descent. I believe they also trace part of Baha'u'llah's lineage to Zoroaster. So there is a connection there. It's not, however, to say that all of the messengers are related to each other, because obviously the messengers that came to the native peoples of the Americas were not directly related to the messengers of the West, because the continents were separated. There was no contact between them. But there are family connections, I guess you could say, to many of the ones in the West.
Thank you. What are the current religions of the West that have suffered the Great Disappointment? Also, can you explain the expectations in Islam of the return in the 1840s? Are the Sunnis or the Shias more likely to experience this?
So the Great Disappointment is a reference to the disappointment of William Miller and his followers in 1844. You can look that up. There's an article on the Great Disappointment in Wikipedia that explains the basics. So yeah, that term particularly refers to that episode. As to the Sunni and the Shiite, clearly, among the Shiites, as I said, the expectation was focused on the year 1844, and that's why it was so revolutionary when the Bab declared in that year. I mean, it's like you have a pile of kindling and it's all set to go, and someone strikes a match and it all went up. You had something like 100,000 people very rapidly became followers. And we, as Baha'is, we also know that about 20,000 of those were killed because the religious forces, the governmental forces, were so concerned that this was going to rock the boat of society, that there was a lot of killing. Like I say, Christ spoke about it will be like lightning which comes out of the east. And really, lightning is a good metaphor for what happened, because it really, when it struck Persia, it was like a real jolt. So Persia, of course, is the central place of Shia Islam. It's not the only place of Shia Islam. There are Shiite communities scattered elsewhere throughout the Islamic world, including some that were in the northern part of the Holy Land, including Akka. And so when my travelers get to Akka, they can find out about the Shiite teachings as well as the Sunni teachings. Sunni Islam has less specific expectations. It's kind of interesting that they speak of the return of Jesus, not the return of Muhammad, but that's just according to some of the references that are in the Quran. So there is a connection there.
Thank you. Have you gotten into the prophetic significance of numerology?
That I haven't spent a lot of time on. I know there was a book by a Robert Riggs. Some of you may remember that. I'm not sure if it's still in print, called The Apocalypse Unsealed. And that delves into the question of numerology a lot. But there are, like I said, this field is so huge. You could do a dozen talks and not cover it. So a lot of people have thought about the coming of the Promised One and found lots of links. About lightning could be the Morse code and the electromagnetic telegraph. Yeah, that's also a fascinating story that the day after the Bob declared, the age of electricity began with the sending of the first telegraph message. So this is, in some sense, the lightning or the control of the electrical forces is certainly a sign of the modern age. We live in the age of electricity. We can hardly imagine getting anything done without electricity. So we have taken the force of lightning and imprisoned it and control it and use it for a million different purposes now. So yes, that's very significant. I think also not only did the telegraph represent a sudden burst forward in communications, traveling from the speed of wind and sail to the speed of light, but also, interestingly, transportation had a sudden leap forward in the following year, in 1845, because prior to that, all the transoceanic transportation was by sailing ship. They had tried steam engines. Steam engines worked for rivers, but they didn't work for oceans because the waves they had paddle wheels on either side of the ship, and the waves did not work with paddle wheels. It also didn't work because the ship carrying cargo would sometimes be riding high and sometimes be riding low. So paddle wheels didn't work for transoceanic shipping. In 1845, they came up with the idea of placing a propeller down below the waves, out the back of the ship, and of course, using steam power to drive the propeller. And that transoceanic crossing first occurred in the summer of 1845, just a few months after the Bob had issued his prayer for greater safety in ocean travel, because his travel to Mecca had been by ocean and had been fraught with a lot of difficulties. So the transportation, ocean-going transportation, really laid the foundation for the global economy. You can't have a global economy unless you have an inexpensive way of shipping massive amounts of materials from one continent to another. So that was a very interesting point in the early months of the Baha'i revelation.
Thank you. Thank you so much again to Mr. Tyson. This was very interesting. We all learned a lot, so we really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you. And thanks to everyone for attending. I hope you find the time well spent.
Definitely. And next week, our speaker will be Dr. Kendall Williams, and his topic is Religion and Science as Two Keys to Reality. So again, these are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, and I'll put the link to our contact form if you're not on our mailing list already. And we'll go ahead and end with the Baha'i song.
Have you heard of Baha'u'llah? promised one to come, fulfilling all prophecy that all of humanity would learn to live in peace as one. Have you heard of Baha'u'llah? Have you heard of Baha'u'llah? Have you heard of Baha'u'llah? I've heard the glad tidings, and I will tell you of Baha'u'llah. Hussein Ali proclaimed his great mission in the year of 1863. He said, I'm Baha'u'llah, the glory of God, the Prince of Peace, the source of unity. Have you heard of Baha'u'llah? Have you heard of Baha'u'llah? Have you heard of Baha'u'llah? I've heard the glad tidings, and I will tell you of Baha'u'llah. His word went forth in tablets of power and love from Mecca, the prison by the sea. He said there's no prison but the prison of self, and that his suffering would set men free. Have you heard of Baha'u'llah? Have you heard of Baha'u'llah? Have you heard of Baha'u'llah? I've heard the glad tidings, and I will tell you of Baha'u'llah. Baha'is there are all over the world who live in service to all humanity. All sheep of one fold, as prophecy had foretold, how powerful Baha'u'llah can be. Now you've heard of Baha'u'llah. Now you've heard of Baha'u'llah. Now you've heard of Baha'u'llah. Spread the glad tidings and tell the people of Baha'u'llah. Go spread the glad tidings and tell the people of Baha'u'llah. Go spread the glad tidings and tell the people of Baha'u'llah.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye.